All right, so today we're going to be talking about XXE injection. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and get into it. This just has to do with how web applications process XML. XXE is referring to XML external entities. And to summarize, those are just customized entities that let you include content from like other sources. And you have to define those in a document type definition or a DTD. So that's basically part of it. It's part of the XML specification. Like that's how it's designed to work, which kind of brings us to why this becomes a problem if it's part of the intended behavior of the application. And similar to other injection types like SQL, although not somewhat similar, is that they usually have to do with applications or developers might implement a library for XML that still has a lot of these potentially dangerous functionalities of XML without making sure that those utilities, like being able to make your own external entities and call them, are being properly sanitized. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and talk about what we might be able to do. And there's quite a few options. You can retrieve files, you can do server-side request forgery if you're clever enough. And then the last two are kind of blind. Obviously, you'd want to do retrieving files in SSRF first if you have the choice. But if for whatever reason you don't see anything being reflected in the application, you could then use the blind strategy. So maybe exfiltrating data to your IP address, or having it send you stuff. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail in the labs today. And then also maybe retrieving certain error messages, or trying to bait out certain error messages from the application to see if you can gather more information. And this example right here I just pulled from Google Images, and it's a straightforward example, and we'll explain a little bit more just because this has some other stuff that might be confusing. So if we're going to try and retrieve files with this, basically if a web application is using one of these libraries to parse XML that allows you to do this, let's say the default is, this is a website that lets you, rank online, it's like a scoreboard for an online game. So the check rank function might, call for a player ID, and if you look at a certain account, it might fill this in and then use that to do whatever kind of parsing it does. Or if you're looking up a player by their ID. The issue is, you can see that XML is being used not only from probably the content type of the request, but from this little header here. And we can try adding our own entity. So in this case, we're creating an entity called XXE, and we're giving it a system command to run, which is just, we're having XXE point to a system file, which is just etc password. So this is how you might be able to read a file. Then instead of using the XML to look up the player ID 32, you might use it to call this external entity that you've just created. And then it will, return with the contents of this file in the place where this player ID's data might have been returned. So, not blind, because it's going to be shown on the in the web application's response. Server-side request forgery works the same way. You can create an entity and point it to, some kind of internal resource. So if it's our target is vulnerable.com, it might be vulnerable.com/admin that you might want to be attacking. And then you could, trigger a request coming from inside that network from this machine that's vulnerable to XML external entity injection. So you would just, again, call it in the response, or call it in the body here. And then in the response, you should see whatever the reply is from that GET request. Or maybe it'll just, in this case, I think it just sends that request and won't show you the reply. But let's say, it's not showing you details on the web application's front end interface. You might want to use some blind techniques. In this case, it's OAST, which is just out of band, or I think, it's out of band security testing, or out of network application security testing. Anyway, OAST is just calling your own IP address or some kind of, resource you control out on the internet, so that you can determine it. We did this with SQL. I think we did this with server-side request forgery also, and it's just a way to verify by sending it to you. So if we control this domain here, we might just make an entity that sends a GET request to our domain. And then we'll have to, in this case, we might see some success using parameter entities instead. So these are just normal external entities. You don't need any special characters. Parameter entities are sometimes treated a little bit differently, but they can only be referenced inside of this DTD, which is anything inside this, doc type brackets. So you'll have to define XXE in this, whoops, you'll have to define XXE in this DTD here, and then you'll also have to reference it again. So just keep that in mind if you're trying to circumvent some of those things. If we're doing blind exfiltration of files, so if you've already gotten OAST to work, you might move on to trying to exfiltrate your data. In this case, we can define a parameter entity called file, and it just points to a file called etc password on the file system. And then we'll make another parameter entity called eval, and this one will basically it has exfiltrate point to our domain and then fills in that file name from this other parameter. So these are all inside the same reference, but whenever you call this DTD that you're hosting on your machine, it's going to I think what it should be doing is, it runs eval. So it determines that exfiltrate points to our domain at file, and then it runs exfiltrate, which then sends that request, and then uses file as another part. So on the target, you would have your DTD look like this, where you just create XXE and then have it call this evil.dtd file, which is just this up here. And in doing so, what it should do is then send whatever these contents are of the file on the target system to your machine on your HTTP listener. In the lab that we're going to do, we're actually going to do some base64 encoding just so all of the data can be represented easily. And then something else you might want to do is just coaxing out error messages. So you might just try to pretty much the same process as the last one. So you will host this on your machine and have the target call out to you, but you'll just have it instead of doing what was the last one called? Instead of doing exfiltrate like we did last time, we would be doing error, and then you'll just have it call or try to send a non-existent, or it'll try and send this file to a non-existent address, which obviously won't work, and then you might be able to get some interesting error messages out of that. There's a few other things that we could talk about. One of them is like repurposing local DTDs, and because that's a little bit more situational, I don't necessarily want to include it, but if you have some file read, or maybe you just have more access to things that are on the target application, or if you're doing, like a white box test or something, you might be able to get some use out of just manipulating DTDs that are already present on the environment. You also might be able to utilize like a few hidden attack surfaces. So like X-include is a header that lets you build documents out. So if you're already inputting some kind of data that might get interpreted in HTML or something, you might be able to use the X-include header to mess with that. Or something else you might be able to do is if you're uploading files, so like a docx or an SVG, those are two file examples that are capable of containing and running like XML, are capable of like parsing XML when they get interpreted by a lot of libraries. So keep that in mind as you're doing your tests. You could also just look at the content type in a post request or something like that and change it from, the default application, whatever, to text XML and see if that works. And aside from that, I think we're good to go ahead and jump into our lab. So the first one is a hard machine called Pollution, and then the second one is an insane machine called Fulcrum. We won't go through the whole machines. We're just going to go through the parts of the machines that have to do with XML external entity injection. And then we'll go ahead and jump back here and talk about prevention techniques. All right, so this machine starts with some like subdomain enumeration, and you'll find this one called forum.collect.htb. And I've already gone through the trouble of making an account, and one of these forum posts will mention this file called proxyhistory.txt. And while this isn't necessarily like relevant to the XML XXE stuff, it's still somewhat important because, you have to at least know how to like look through some of this stuff and find things. And I just thought this part of the machine was kind of cool, but you're able to find this proxy history thing, and you'll notice one of the requests in here. It's kind of difficult to see, but right here has to do with sending a request to setting someone's role to an administrator. And to make this a little bit easier, I think we can actually just decode these things. So if I were to like do So you'll see this is like what the post request looks like, and it's just post set role to admin, and then you'll see that it contains a token, but the only thing that it really seems to specify the user is this like PHP session ID. This other encoded part, I think, is just the response that says like, that was correct. We'll go ahead and look at that too. Yeah, same thing. So it should give us a redirect if we're able to successfully set our own role to the administrator. I think to do that first, we need to register an account on this part. So what I'm going to do first actually is I'm going to turn on my proxy, and I'm just going to grab a regular GET request for this page and put it in my repeater so that we can paste this other thing in once we get our session information. So now I'll just go ahead and do register Gabe, password. Okay, so now we've got a login we can use, and we have a session ID. So I'll just go ahead and copy that. And then, or actually, what we'll do first is I'll get this post request here. And upon sending this the first time, I think it gives us a redirect anyway. But obviously, it's not, the session ID isn't an account that we can control. So what we'll do is I'll just go back to Firefox, grab my session ID, and throw it in this request. Thankfully, we get a 302, follow the redirection. So now if we sign into my account, or maybe if I just refresh the page, we might be able to look at other stuff. I think maybe, am I messing around? Let me try logging out and then logging back in. I thought we were supposed to see admin stuff right off the bat. I might be wrong. Oh yeah, there we go. I forgot. Admin. Oh, it should give us access to that. Maybe I messed it up here. Yeah, but why is that redirecting me to the home page? Is what's so confusing about that. Oh, was that it? Did I really just have an extra line and that's the only issue? Oh, that's so frustrating. Maybe not. Okay, well, okay. I just messed up the request that I had, but basically, now that we're actually in here looking at like a registration form in the API, we can actually fill this out and test something. Yep, I think we got, okay, everything's good. And you'll notice it sends this post request to an endpoint that's just /API, and it also includes all of this XML data that we can mess around with. So let's just send this to the repeater, see what happens. It gives us an okay message for the status. And I think the first thing we can do is, because like, none of this information, like my inputs, GAB and BABABA, the username and passwords, they're not reflected in this response, and they're not reflected on the web page. So it makes the most sense for us to just kind of skip over to the blind strategies. So what I'm just going to do is open a listener and see if I can make, or at least see if I can just get it to request something for me. So I think here's what we'll do. At the top here, right after this part, I'm just going to make my own. So we'll do doc type root, and we'll say, or we'll do a parameter one just to make sure that it works on the first try. And we'll do and we are at 138 today. sure to call our parameterized entity like that. And then we can just close off those things. Hopefully that works on the first try. I messed it up, but that's weird. We're getting a lot of stuff back. Let's see. I did my doc type root, open, next system. Ooh, that might be why. There we go. Okay. You need a space in there for the syntax, but in this case, yeah, the user already exists because we've already requested this, but you can see that we got this request back, and obviously we don't have a file called XXE hosted here, but we do have a malicious DTD that we can use to exfiltrate a file. So I will just cat that out real quick. And here's what it looks like. So it's just our own version. So this file parameter entity will PHP base 60, or it just uses PHP to base 64 encode the contents of index.php on this site. And then it will also create this eval parameter, or not parameter, parameterized entity that will then exfiltrate that back to our listener. So all I need to do is start up my listener again. And then this time I'm just going to ask it to, instead of getting XXE, get xxe.dtd. I'll send it. And then it grabs it. Ooh, I think I might need to edit one more thing. Maybe? No, that should be okay. Did I mess up? 138 file. It should be sending it back to me, but I might be messing something else up. Oh wait, yeah, it gave another error. What gives? That's interesting. So wait, this works fine, but as soon as I add the .dtd at the end of this, it throws a fit. That's strange. Let me put a space there. Still kind of weird. Not sending it back. Let me try. I'm just going to grab and paste some of these things from my notes. Or actually, oh wait, what if that file doesn't exist? Because that's trying to get this. Let me change that. And we're just going to have this get like Etsy hostname. Ah, that was the problem. Okay. So even though it's still submitting this error, which I don't totally get, and I'm definitely not going to read the whole thing out, but you can see it did what we expected it to do. It sends us back the base 64 encoded contents of that file. So if I do echo, you can see the host name of the machine is Pollution. We could do this to read other files. All we have to do is just edit our DTD, and we can have it read like, let's see, password. Oh, that's going to be too long, isn't it? Yeah, okay. That's the issue for that. Let me try. Maybe there's another file we can read. I don't know. Etsy Shadow's probably going to be too long too. Host name is fine. You know what? I think that's a fine way of demonstrating it. Is just showing that we can read Etsy host name. And that is something you probably ought to keep in mind when testing this too, is that sometimes if your output is too long, you know, the application might just fail to parse that information. So that's all we've got for Pollution. The example is just how to exfiltrate data using blind XML XML external entity injection. Next, what we're going to be doing is a machine called Fulcrum. So I'll check back with you, and then we'll get started with that. All right. So for this machine, Fulcrum, we're basically going to follow a really similar methodology of the same thing. So we do some enumeration of the open ports. We find a port on 56423, and when you send a request to it, it's just an API that replies with, this heartbeat ping pong type message. What we can initially try and do is just, let me see. I think we can change. Do we need to change the content type? Text HTML, application XML. Okay, no, we shouldn't. So what we should be able to do is just throw in some XML stuff. Let me just do some Googling here. We'll just grab a sample or something from GitHub here. I think this will work fine for what we want to do. And instead of doing replace, actually, it doesn't really matter what that's called. Example test doc type, sure. And let's just make this entity like, the encoding might need to be specific, but I'll get rid of this because we don't need it. And let's see, we'll do entity example. Instead of that, we're going to want system. Because this is blind again, I'm going to do parameter entity stuff. We're going to say system, and we're going to have it call our IP address again. We'll have it ask for a file called XXE. Close the quotes. And then outside of this, we're just going to call the name, which is just going to be replace, right? No, wait a minute. Doc type. No, it's going to be... I think that should work. There's my Python command. And sweet, we got it to call out, so at least we know that that's working. And of course, we don't have an XXE file here, but we do have, in this case, PHP that we're going to try and use. So I actually think, I might need to fix this. So I might need to go ahead and just write something new because, yeah, I think... So we could do the same file reading that we did last time. Okay, now I remember. Okay, let me just do... let me just go ahead. I'm going to go through my file system and just copy this. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to change the file name here. Or actually, we'll leave it as hostname for now, just so we can look at the example. So again, we'll just go back here, change this to XXE dot document type definition. We'll get this base64 encoded content. And you'll see the Etsy hostname file contents. We can read other file contents, though, with this strategy. And earlier in the machine, I don't have a port scan up on here, but we know that there's something open on, what's it called? There's some kind of file, or not file, there's a web server being hosted on port number 4, which was weird. And we can just test for, I think it's just regular file path names. So if we just do like, whoops. And then we can do uploads. Or, no, it's a PHP. I'm kind of looking off my notes for half of this. But we can do that same thing. Just go ahead. What am I doing? Here we go. You'll notice it base64 encoded the contents of that file. Let me just go ahead and exit out of that one. And now we can see the contents of like index.php. And you'll see if the server that's calling out to it is not localhost, it'll give you some kind of error. And otherwise, let's see, it's not really, the line breaks are kind of weird, but otherwise it'll bring you to port 4 home. Try again later. Okay. So, the interesting thing about this is that if it's under maintenance, if it gives you this error that you're not coming from localhost, or if it doesn't hit that error, it looks like you can see right here, index.php page equals home. So it has this kind of URL redirect. This is no longer, it's kind of half and half, 1 foot in the door XML external entity injection. The other half is server-side request forgery, right? We know that if we see parameters like this that are loading other web pages, even though this is just, page equals home, we could still try and use that to trigger like a server-side request forgery thing, especially given it's sanitizing based off of the, the fact that the remote address for the request has to come from localhost. So what we can do, and I'll just show it here, let me go ahead and cancel, is we have this simple PHP reverse shell that I'm actually going to have to edit because my IP address has changed since the last time I did this. So let me just do 138. And then I wonder. Yeah, okay, now I remember. Okay, so we can do, I'll host that again. And then I also need to have a listener here on the port I want to get that shell from. And then back here in my repeater this time, instead of calling my own IP address, what I want to do is see if I can trigger that redirect first. So I'm going to do example system. That's all fine. I'm just going to have it call out to me, but the IP address is going to be, yeah, okay, 001 on port 4, because that's where that web page is. Let me make this a little bit wider so the formatting isn't all messed up. And it's going to be index.php. And we'll see if this redirect actually works. It doesn't look like it did on that attempt. Maybe page HTTP. It's calling example. Localhost 1. That should be calling back out to my listener, but maybe, oh, wait a minute. It's, I think it's because this isn't a PHP file, because it said that it needed to have that like PHP extension or something, right? Oh, wait, home wasn't the name. It was page. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if we use page, you can see that there's a redirect problem. So now we're able to do some server-side request forgery. We're making the application server through this entity injection send a request to the web server on port 4 on our behalf, and we're even getting it to redirect and bounce over to us. Oh crap, that must have, wait, what? Oh, it autofills. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we don't even need to specify that it's PHP because it's already expecting a PHP result, so it's going to append .php to the request. So you can see once we sent that, it got PHP or XXE.php, and then executed the code that was on that web application, which gives us a shell. So there's kind of a little bit cooler example than Pollution, where we use XML external entity injection to do some server-side request forgery. And in this case, we're able to go as far as to execute code on the target machine. So that's all we've got in terms of labs for today. So I'll just go ahead and turn it back to prevention. All right, and prevention, as it kind of should have hinted in the beginning, but prevention, normally this vulnerability is going to be there because of a parsing library that developers introduced, and all you're really going to need to do is just disable those features, and most APIs have the functionality to disable certain features that you don't want to use. So if you implemented an XML parsing library that has dangerous features enabled, go ahead and disable them. You also might want to just go ahead and disable like resolution of external entities, and maybe even disable things like I talked about earlier with X include support. And you can do that in different ways. It just depends on what API you're using. But that's all we've got for today. So I'll catch you in the next one, and have a good weekend.